I had some internet or connection issues. I don't know, but I'm super excited to have you on. I think this is a very informative podcast for a lot of people, players, parents, and coaches. Tonight we're going to be talking, not only for basketball players, but for like the parents, coaches, trainers, and really anybody involved in youth athletics. Like I said, is Brian. So joining us tonight is Brian Brooks. He's the owner of Brooks Sports Performance, one of the most respected names in sports performance, athlete development, rehabilitation, and movement training. Brian earned his degree in exercise physiology and human performance from the University of Louisville and has spent over a decade helping athletes maximize performance while also understanding how to train smarter, recover properly, and build longevity in sports. Over the years, Brian has worked with athletes from youth all the way up to the professional ranks, including consulting and performance work connected to organizations such as the Boston Celtics during their championship season, the Houston Rockets, the Indiana Pacers, the Minnesota Vikings, and multiple NBA G League organizations. But what really stands out about Brian isn't just the resume, it's the impact he's had over athletes over the years. More than 100 athletes under his guidance have gone to receive scholarships across multiple sports, and his training philosophy has become respected because he focuses on real development, not social media gimmicks, not flashy drills, not take motivation clips, but actual athlete growth in movement quality, injury prevention, strength development, and long term success. So, Brian, tonight we're going to dive into the current state of youth basketball training, load management, and overuse injuries, why so many athletes are burning out, the misinformation epidemic in sports training, social media trainers versus real development, what athletes actually do differently, while recovery is more important than most people realize, stories from athletes Brian has worked with, and what parents need to understand about development today. Brian, first of all, man, thank you for taking the time to join us tonight. I know you're very busy, and we really appreciate you coming on, dude.
Oh, happy to be here. Happy to be here.
So let's talk a little bit about your journey before we dive into that stuff. For the people that may not know your story, you can take us back a little bit. Talk about your background, where your passion for athlete development comes from, and how Brooks Sports Performance originally started.
Okay. So I grew up playing sports. Obviously, in high school, I played golf, basketball, track and field, football, basketball, the whole nine. Um, Truly think I could have played college soccer, golf, and football. I chose the football route. Went to the University of Louisville. My first year there, my appendix ruptured. I let that go for probably about a week. So I became septic, super
Oh,
sick. Um, Went in the hospital, had emergency surgery, went in weighing 230 pounds, came out weighing about 170. So that kind of initially got me interested in kind of, I'm not going to say injury prevention, but just kind of the rehab aspect and building yourself back up. I began working closely with a guy who was local and owned a gym here, kind of the biggest gym around. I started coming back in after my surgery, and he asked what happened, and began working with him. It took me about a year and a half to kind of get back. Once I got back, U of L had coaching changes, kind of started bringing in their own people. So I did the logical thing and decided with no college game film to go pro. So over the course of about a year and a half, I built a name for myself through various camps, regional camps, national camps. So with no college film, was able to get signed with an agency. Um, and then within about 6 months, became a top three free agent kicker in the nation. Over those 2 to 3 years, I probably had workouts with every NFL team. I was with the Chiefs for a little bit, the Texans a little bit, the 49ers a little bit, and lots of broken promises, lots of agents that were going to do this and that and didn't. So one aspect that I really help like my pro level guys is I've been through the process of just being with agents and the politics and a lot of things involved. So once I finally got kind of where I needed to be with football, I found out that I was having twins. So hung the cleats up, came home. Today we have 5 kids, which best thing that ever happened to me. Wouldn't do it again. I mean, wouldn't change things if I could. So the next closest thing I can do is be around these athletes currently and try to help them from a lot of the mistakes that I made early on, and a lot of the stupid stuff I did. So just trying to help them navigate not only their bodies, but just who they surround themselves with, and just kind of making sense of the whole process to them, from pro guys to high school guys going through the recruiting process, et cetera.
Yeah, that's a huge key, man. Having like been through the process, you're very credible. You've been through high school, through college. You've been through, like the pros. You were talking about the agents. You were talking about all the broken promises. But one thing people probably don't realize is the politics in sports. Like a lot of people don't think about politics, but when money's involved, like politics is always going to be involved, right?
Yes.
So though, the like the background, everything that could happen. What's really interesting about your story is, like I said, you've seen sports from so many different angles. You've worked with younger athletes beginning their journey, high school athletes chasing scholarships, college players trying to level up, and professionals just trying to stay healthy and maximize their performance.
Right.
How much has your perspective on training changed over the years from when you first started compared to now?
Um, I wish it wouldn't have had to change, but now it's become more. I'm more of a manager than a trainer. It's with this year-round stuff and AAU and just constant school schedule and summer ball. I basically have to work around these athletes' schedule and do the best I can and just fit pieces in. With no true off season, it's hard because these kids are in competition mode 24/7. So it makes it hard for a lot of these kids to develop. So if you're developed, you're ahead of the game, and then if you're underdeveloped, it's hard to catch up because you don't have the time. You either got to pick: am I going to play or am I going to sit here and develop? And a perfect example, like Derek Anderson, who played for UK years and years ago, won a national championship and then won a championship with the Heat. Was the first Jordan Brand athlete. I train his nephew, and that was the conversation we had. Was he's not doing AAU this year. He's not doing school ball this summer. It's strictly just develop. And nowadays it's hard to do that because it's going against the grain and nobody does it. But that's truly how you're going to get better: is skill training, weight training, and that's it.
Yeah, with everything going on year round play, it feels like there's so much pressure for these kids to be playing all the time, to always, be somewhere, to play somewhere. And, your perspective is like kind of set back and you can develop and then come in and play. But, when everybody's telling these kids, hey, you need to be here, you need to be here, like it's hard for them to have the patience to understand, hey, if I take 6 months off or a year off to develop, I'll be better in that 12-month period than just keep going full blast.
And a lot of kids are scared that they're going to miss the opportunity to be seen. But nowadays, like when I was playing, I sent out 20 or 30 DVDs a week to player personnel directors, head coaches, special team coaches, and just hope that someone would watch it. Now with social media and recruiting services and websites, like it's hard to be missed. And I mean, I think kids need to realize, like, if you take a year off and you put a video up of you jumping 40 inches and you got a 6 whatever wingspan and you're going to get noticed. And you're going to get some great exposure through this AAU programs and things like that. But a lot of it too is, what if we took that money and spent it on individualized training and recovery and skill training? Where would we be?
And a point I had on Instagram Live, I think it was last night, was it's better to be seen by 20 people that can actually help you than 20,000 that are just giving you an opinion. So there, if you have the skill set and the size, you'll be seen. You don't need 20,000 people that don't know what they're talking about to validate your performance. And you've worked with athletes at elite levels, NBA players, NFL guys, high college athletes. What are some things people misunderstand about how those athletes actually train? Because I think social media has created this illusion that an elite training is all flashy drill and crazy workouts.
I think most people think, like once you get high school, a certain gate opens up and there's these magical exercises. And then once you get to college, they're doing something different. And once you get to the pros, it's something even different. And couldn't be further from the truth. My pro level guys are doing the same thing my high school kids are doing, just at a much higher level, much more efficiently, much stronger, much better movers. But things don't change. And on social media, you'll click and you'll see some fancy exercise, and that's the icing on the cake. But what you don't see is the base of that cake being built. So you don't see the heavy squats, you don't see the deadlifts, you don't see the pressing, because it's not attractive for social media. But you'll see somebody hooked up a band to his knee over his head with a ball, which has a purpose, but it has a purpose after the main course has been done. And instead of what's happening, and now these kids are just taking the appetizer and they're just doing that, if that makes sense. And not realizing you're watching a 24-year-old grown man versus a 16-year-old do it. And there's different needs for different stages of your life, just like anything. And it's kind of like investing money. What you do early is going to be different than you do late, and so on. And it's the same deal. A 16-year-old doesn't need what a 24-year-old needs, and vice versa.
And I think you made a good point, because people see like highlights of the training online, but they don't realize how much of an elite performance actually is built through repetition, consistency, movement quality, a big thing, recovery, discipline, and fundamentals. And we work with a ton of athletes who have gone on to achieve major success. Without necessarily naming everybody, who are some of your former athletes or clients that people may recognize? And what has it been like watching, those guys grow over the years?
I mean, just my week. This week I've had, with the exception of, I was training Rondell Moore until he tragically committed suicide. One of the best human beings I've ever been around. One of the most professional. I could go for hours on him about the way he did things, the way he operated. One of the, if not the best prepared athlete I've ever dealt with. But Ray Spalding, Grace Berger, Jay Scrub, Sean East, Trey Moses is overseas, JJ Weaver's in the CFL. And then from a high school scene, like Jordan Mitchell, Boogie Cook. I'll see Josh Lindsay on occasion. I'd like to see him a little more. He's busy doing dunk contests. Xavier Cosby. I'm doing Trey Hilrich's ACL repair. So I got a lot of high school kids that are coming up. And the coolest thing about this is those high school kids, like I was talking about earlier, they get to see what the pro people are doing and the way they operate. And they realize that the stuff they're doing, it's the same thing, but they see what level they need to be at. And they see the differences and they see the strengths. I was fortunate enough to do D'Angelo Russell had an elite camp here in Louisville just last week. So I did the elite portion, like strength and conditioning. And it was probably 18 to 20 kids on a given day. And just to see the differences in those kids. And I mean, trying to give them, what we were trying to do is create a preview of what's at the next level. So, we did a 6 to 7:30 a.m. on court. We had weights 8 to 9:30, and then they had a break, and then they were back on the court 4 to 6 at night. And we were trying to get them to basically exhaustion, but I mean, that's what's going to be at the next level for them. And if they're not strong and they're not ready, then they're going to be a year behind. And I think that's what happens with a lot of kids once they get to college, is they're not prepared. So first year is catch up. Well, then they don't play that first year. Frustration sets in, and then everything hits the fan.
One thing I find interesting is about hearing about athletes before they become successful. Were there certain athletes you've worked with where early on you already could tell that they had a different mentality or different mentally?
Yeah. You can give me probably about a week with an athlete, and I can tell you exactly where they're at. I mean, where they are with understanding the process, how serious they're going to take it, and how far they're going to go. You can tell pretty early on how they push themselves in here. And I'm not somebody that's going to walk around with a clipboard forcing you to do X, Y, and Z. We kind of leave it up to you how you're feeling, and it's up to the individual to push themselves to that extent. And I think it's good for them to learn. If they don't need somebody there to motivate them every day, because it's not going to be there. So if you can't learn to motivate yourself, then it's going to be a rough time.
You kind of spoke about, like, I was going to ask, like, what really separates those athletes, because I mean, talent obviously matters. If you don't have talent, then the rest doesn't matter. But I believe that your mentality, your consistency, coachability is a key word I like to use, and discipline matter just as much, if not more, like long term, right?
Yes. I mean, it's basically, I mean, essentially, how long can you do the basics, and how long and how high level can you do the basics every day, every situation. You got to fall in love with the basics. You got to fall in love with the schedule and the grind. And I mean, it can't be. It's not Instagram. It's not flashy. You're going to do Monday is pretty scheduled out. Tuesday's pretty scheduled out, and then the next week it's on repeat, and then the year it's on repeat. And how highly can you do that without getting bored is a huge key. And I mean, I look at like obviously my pro athletes are great at it. I mean, I know like Shawnee still get on the court 2-3 times a day. He comes to me once a day. Like it's incredible how invested he is on the court. I mean, Jordan Mitchell, for example, is like with a high school level athlete at his age, prepares as much like a pro as I've ever seen. So we'll do recovery lifts, we'll do activation lifts. He'll do stuff on his own, and I mean you can see what happens, and it's just every day is like Groundhog Day, and it gets boring, but that's what has to happen.
Yeah, and I think that's used for like the young athletes or guys listening right now because social media I think has created this illusion that you're going to be successful overnight, or you have that mindset, hey, tomorrow, I'm going to make it. Everybody sees the final product, with the pros, but they don't see the years of sacrifice, repetition, recovery, discipline, and like you said, the boring work that that it goes in. Have there been athletes you've worked with that maybe weren't the most naturally gifted, early on, but through consistency and work ethic, became high level players and athletes?
100%. And I think that's one of the problems with youth sports is everyone wants overnight success, and they're trying to do rankings in sixth grade, seventh grade, and that's not the goal. The goal is to peak when you're a senior in high school. If you're the best 12-year-old, that's great, but like nobody really cares. It doesn't mean anything because you've got 6 more years. So in particular, I trained a volleyball girl, and I mean, her junior year actually got cut from her high school team. She began training with me, worked her ass off with me with skill set stuff with volleyball, and fast forward a year later, she's getting a Division I scholarship. And I mean, she got cut from a local high school team here, but instead of letting that deter, and the other thing is too, and it's not knocking these coaches necessarily, but some of these high school coaches aren't the best. They do it as a side hustle. Some of them do it seriously, but they're not the best evaluators of talent at all times. So, and even at that level, there's politics. So I mean, it's and you're not making excuses for kids, but there's way more politics involved in high school and college sports than you would ever imagine, which means you have to over prepare and you have to leave no doubt that you belong.
We were talking about politics. I've been scouting since 2015, and the stories and the things that I've seen, kids that are, more developed or have more talent not getting the same amount of playing time, sometimes not even playing. And I've seen programs and schools, it seems like they would rather lose than put the best kids out on the floor, and it's sad. But, your story is like one of my favorite things about sports, honestly, is sometimes the kid who develops correctly, stays healthy, and keeps improving slowly ends up passing everybody who's peaked early because, like you said, a 12-year-old, you're not going to help a college team win. You're not going to play professionally. So who cares, right?
Pretty much. And I mean, it's the same thing with anything. I've been doing this 15, 20 years. Every year I like to think I've evolved and gotten better. But, one of the reasons that I stay so busy is A, I've gotten better, but B, I've outlasted people, and it's the same thing. I've just grinded on a daily basis. This has been my main thing for 15 to 20 years, how I provide for my family. This is never a side hustle. It was an all-in thing, which requires continued education. It requires you to stay up to date. A side hustle, which is unfortunately like a lot of these trainers do, it's strictly a side hustle, which means it gets put off to the side and you kind of wing it. And it's very similar to these athletes. It's just a grind.
Yeah, I think the biggest key, with me or with you is just the consistency. Always showing up, no matter if anybody else shows up. And I'd like to get into something we talked about before, the show, or we talked about before, is because honestly, I think it's like a major issue in sports is young athletes or players today are trying to train like professionals before they're even mastered the basics. You see 13, 14, and 15-year-old kids doing advanced jump programs, overload training, crazy recovery, all these gadgets, weighted plyometrics,
Right.
all this stuff that you see online, Instagram. From your perspective, like what's going wrong with youth athlete development right now?
There's just a lot of people doing it that don't understand physiology. I think is the main thing, and then the other thing is what's your goal? And I don't think anybody. I think very rarely, especially with youth sports, does someone set out goals. It's just kind of put these kids through obstacle courses, entertain them for 45 minutes, make sure they're tired, and send them home. So, my pet peeve is all the jump training and Vertimax and all these plyometrics. From a standpoint of plyometrics, a kid has to have a certain level of strength before they even attempt plyometrics. But we do it the reverse way. We start with plyos before we even do weights. I look at basketball like kind of a bucket approach, and it's what do these kids get on the court and what do they not get on the court. So if I take a youth athlete or a high school athlete, what's the first thing they do in basketball? A ton. They jump. So why are we going to fill that bucket with more jumping when they've already have that bucket filled? There's something over here that doesn't get done on the court, so why don't we focus on that? And I think the second thing is kids are doing specific stuff that like pros are doing. Well, the pros are doing it because that specific thing is going to make a 0.5, 1% difference. When your kid isn't strong enough to squat his body weight, those are, you're picking up pebbles before you pick up boulders. You know what I mean? And I think people just have a very bad understanding of physiology and what needs to go on. Um, a kid that's not fast or can't jump, jumping more is not going to make him jump better. The reason he or she can't jump is he's not strong enough. So it's like not making fun of a Honda Civic, but if you have a Honda Civic and you floor it, it's only going to go a certain speed. You keep flooring it, it's probably going to continue that speed or go less until you upgrade the engine. The engine is muscles, tendon strength, reactive, things like that, rate force development, all these things that go into lifting weights. And I just think people just have a terrible misunderstanding of how the body works.
Yeah, I think the scary part is like a lot of parents don't know what good training is compared to what's bad training. If they see people with a lot of followers online, you know, kids or athletes automatically think, that these people know what they're doing, right?
Right. And I think, unfortunately, the scarier thing is most trainers don't know what good training is. Um, and I think like when we flip through social media, we see clips. I won't mention his name because I like him a lot, but I had a high school kid reach out and he's like, I love your stuff. I follow you. I copy everything. And I was like, please don't, because you don't know. We're posting a 5 to 7 second clip. You don't know what we're trying to get. You don't know what adaptation we're trying to get, what point of the workout that's at, what that athlete did before, what they're doing after, and it's just a little snippet. And I mean, I'm happy to write it out for you. I'd rather you do a program. I'd rather write you a free program than you mess your stuff up just combining a bunch of little clips that I put up. And I think that's where people mess up is, like I said, you have no clue what went on before, what's going on after, what they're doing tomorrow, what they did before. You know what I mean?
Yeah, like you said, that 5 to 7 minute clip, you have no idea what's happened before that, what's going to happen after that. And honestly, I think that's how social media it trained athlete development maybe forever.
Right.
Training almost becomes entertainment instead of actual development. Would you agree that like a lot of athletes today are focusing more on looking like they train hard instead of actually improving or developing?
I think they are. I think a lot of trainers are to blame. They set up obstacle courses like it's Ninja Warrior. And we're doing just crazy ladder drills and crazy just off the wall stuff that has just no there's just no relevance. If you go to a pro weight room or a college, you're not going to see a Vertimax. You're going to see very little agility ladders unless it's to warm up. It's weights, and more weights, and it's learning how to use those to create different angles and adaptations and rate force development and all this stuff that goes into it. And I think the crazy thing is, like, I'll get a lot of kids that come from maybe a trainer that does some crazy stuff with obstacle course type stuff. But when they finally realize like the process of trying to be strong, they love it. because now you have numbers to chase and it's competitive, and they see it's very hard for you to see if you pick up, doing a ladder drill better. And it doesn't really matter because it's just a memory pattern. But you have data with weights of where I was week 1, where I am week 6, where I am week 12, and then you have comparative data of where I need to be. What are combine numbers? What are this? What are that? And I think it's interesting to see that kids would much rather train the way that we train here than they would just crazy stuff because they get enough of that on the court.
Yeah, and just speaking about basketball, itself, it already puts a huge amount of stress on the body, and you've got some kids, stacking school practice, AAU tournament. They have their individual workouts, then they have strength training, jump programs, extra conditioning, camps, and showcases. At what point does working harder actually become counterproductive?
Very quickly, I started with Jeff Johnson, who went to Atherton, and I think he's going to Spalding. And it was his first day today, and we just had a conversation about if you took two kids and both kids did the exact same workout, weight wise, they did the same basketball workouts, but one was actually on a schedule to create recovery, and one was just throwing darts. The kid that has a schedule is going to be far ahead, and they're doing the same work. It's just how you program that work. So, like I was explaining to Jeff, like if you can wake up, and it's the same premise that like Rondell Moore used to do. He'd wake up, he would go to therapy, he'd come straight to me, he'd go home and catch balls, and then he's done. And it may suck because you got 6 hours of just constant work, but the minute you're done, you can start recovering. So you charge, it's just like charging your phone. If I put my phone on the plug and let it charge for 12, 15 hours, I got a full battery. If I'm putting the charger in my phone every 2 hours and then I'm interrupting it, taking off, aka working out again, it can never get a full charge.
Yeah, and load management overuse. Like load management's become like one of the most debated topics in basketball. Older generations sometimes hear that phrase and instantly think athletes are they're soft now, but there's real science behind recovery and overuse. How important is load management specifically for young athletes?
It's massive. And I think, people, again, it's just people don't understand the way the body works. So, when you're just fatigued, it's like trying to, it's driving when you're tired. It's hard to stay focused. It's hard to stay alert. It's hard to stay anything. So when you look at like muscle aspect, the way it should work, brain creates a signal, shoots it down spinal cord, shoots it to muscle. Muscle should absorb about 70% of that load. Tendon, joint absorbs about 30% of that load. When you get overtrained, now the numbers flip. Now that muscle can't fire properly. Maybe you're absorbing 50% through muscle. Now you're at 50% through joint tendon, and that's how injuries create. And then your efficient movers who can keep their muscles firing because their schedule is correct, they may absorb 80% through muscle, 20% through tendon. So now their efficiency is huge, and then they're recovering better because it's less stress on the joint. So like if you look at Tyrese Halliburton with his Achilles, what happened before? He's overloaded. He's got a calf strain. So now that calf can't produce the force that it needs to. So now that signal shoots more towards his Achilles. Achilles can't handle it. And then that's the end result.
So, what are some warning signs that
And it's
like
kind of
parent?
a,
Oh, I'm sorry, I interrupted you.
no, I'm just saying, like, and there's a little saying that, like a whisper is a scream, meaning like if you feel a little something in your calf, it's not just because, it's your body telling you something. And what we tend to do is not pay attention and we just keep going. Or, go home and put ice on it, or we put some Normatec boots on thinking it's going to do something, and it's not. It's your body saying, hey, I need a day off. I need to rest.
So, kind of like what I was going to say is, what are some warning signs like coaches, parents, trainers should notice, like when a young athlete is physically overworked? Is it just like the aches and pains, or
Aches and pains, and I think with all this technology and all this data and all this, we forget the simplest thing is first thing I do I ask when anybody comes in my facility is how you feel. Just a basic question. And it may be I feel like shit. It may be I feel great, and we go off of that. So I mean, your kid or your athlete should be able to give you some kind of insight into that. And if they can't, if you notice that it's taken them a long time to get loose, or their speed is dropped, or it seems like they're not jumping, the most infamous thing is like with high school basketball, halfway through the year, you'll hear all these kids and athletes saying they're losing their bounce, and they're not losing their bounce. They're overworked and they're weak as shit. So what happens is, it's back to like what I was saying, we train off season 2-3 days a week, and then once the season hits, we stop training. So we get detrained in about 8 or 10 days, which means our muscles aren't firing correctly. So then halfway through the season, where that calf is supposed to be firing, it's not. And then that's when the injuries happen. So like during the season, like with all my athletes, as long as I see you once a week, I can maintain at least some level of strength to where it takes the pressure off those tendons and joints, if that makes sense.
It does make sense. You're just saying like if a muscle's not absorbing a certain amount like it's supposed to,
Right.
and another muscle attending is taking on more, sooner or later it's going to break down, right?
Well, that, and people don't understand, like recovery can be in the form of weightlifting. So like, like I was saying earlier, Jordan, and I'm referencing back, but like King of the Bluegrass, which is the tournament, that goes on, and it's game after game after game after game. He was coming in every day and either doing an activation lift, or as he was fatiguing later in that tournament, we would do a recovery lift. And, people always want to ice and do cryotherapy and all this stuff. What heals your tissue is blood. That's what carries your nutrients. It's what carries your oxygen. It carries everything. So blood flow, heat, is what promotes healing. So he comes in here and we'll do certain movements and we'll do isometric holds and we'll try to get as much blood in the muscle so it starts healing that tissue so he's ready the next game. And there's just so many different techniques to do, but going home and just throwing some ice on it isn't going to cut it.
Yeah, I think this is like an old school
Yeah.
approach compared to like the new science that we have today. And we were talking about being overloaded. Like, do you think like today's basketball culture has normalized like the year-round competition too much? Because like we were talking about, kids based now basically playing basketball 12 months a year without almost no real recovery periods.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the worst thing that ever happened to sports. With basketball, baseball, everything. And, two things happen. One, kids quit playing multiple sports. So, where people don't realize, like, if you're a basketball player and then you go play soccer, it's two different sets of muscles. You know what I mean? So, you're giving basketball specific muscles a break while other things work. And then also, what you're doing is you're balancing out the seesaw. So the stuff that's getting overworked over here and deficient is now getting worked over here via another sport. So that's number one. But then the number two thing, which, I think at a certain age, you do need to specialize. I think if you're a junior in high school and you've been a football star and a basketball star, you eventually got to put your eggs in one basket. You don't have to do it at 10 years old. Um, but then what happens with all this year round stuff at 10, 12, 13 years old? You're in competition mode all the time. So, let's take, I think I used the example, university, let's take U of L football. What they do preseason is different than in season. What they do in season is different than postseason. And then total off season is different. So an athlete truly develops like in his or her actual like off season where there's no practice. You're doing some skill training and this and that, but that's when we're hammering in movement patterns. That's when we're just getting stronger. You can't do that when games are going on. And unfortunately for these kids, games and practices are going on all the time. So, like I said, competition mode, all you're trying to do is maintain or hang on for dear life. But the problem is you can't hang on for dear life when it's 365.
Yeah, and then people wonder why we're seeing, or it seems like we're seeing more ACL injuries, stress fractures, I think like tendon issues. And what I see a lot is burnout at younger ages than like ever before, it seems like.
And I think it's hard because, like, even if you love basketball and when you're doing it, it's nice to have a break, but it's impossible. Like, my kids now, my high school kids, they went from AAU straight to high school season. High school summer league, and then the minute summer league ends, AAU tournament the next weekend, and it's just full blast until school starts. And then once they get into school, they may get like a 2 week break, and then it's it. And like right now, I think the dead period's still going on, but AAU's going on, so there's no dead period. It's just constant, just hammering away at these young kids, and we forget. Like I had a kid in here earlier, and he's 6'9". You forget, like he's 14 years old. He doesn't have the hormones. He doesn't have the nutrition. He doesn't have the capacity to recover from all this.
Yeah, I mean, that period's 2 weeks, but they're still playing. Like I see a lot of kids playing like EYBL or Adidas 3SSB, and like during the dead period, like some local team will pick them up and they'll play for them. Like it just seems like you know I don't know if there's the outside pressure or, I know these kids love the game so much, but it just seems like there's so much of a pressure for them to constantly be playing somewhere, to be in front of a camera, to be on here. They think, if I'm playing or if I'm not playing, I'm going to get more exposure. Somebody's going to see me. I just think there's a lot of outside pressure with that. And I think at the end of the day, like, if we could look back a year from now, like look back and be like, dang, if I set out those 2 weeks, how much better could I have been? But it just seems like we don't have the patience to do
Well,
that, right?
I think the real telling sign is like I have a lot of kids getting ready for college right now, so they're out of summer league, they're out of AAU, and obviously they're older, but the growth you see from girls and guys, I probably have 2 or 3 girls getting ready for college and probably 4 or 5 guys getting ready for college. But the growth from senior year when they stop playing to when they leave for college is the biggest jump they have. And it's not because they're older, it's because we can focus on a true off season. And it's the first chance these kids have had in their life to have a true off season. And I mean, it's only a 4 or 5 month period, but the progress is crazy. And that's the biggest jump these kids will have from 8th grade till high school. So they'll get more, I'll get more out of them in those 5 months than I will in 4 years.
So we were talking about, like, do you try to give your kids the advice to take those 2 weeks off, or do you kind of just leave it up to them and their families or
I
coaches?
leave it up to them. I learned a long time ago I can give advice, but I'm not going to convince a parent exactly what to do. So I mean, I try to steer them a certain way, but the only thing I try to get for every kid I train is at least one 24-hour reset and then one day of just active rest. So if it's form shooting or if it's just kind of screwing around on a court, but as long as I can get those 2 things, that's good enough. Instead of being super stringent, I try to keep bare minimums. So, the minute they stop a basketball workout or a weight workout, if I can get a 24-hour reset and just let that kid rest, I'm happy. And I mean, I would love more, but I know that, that's the most I'm going to get.
Yeah, and so I just want to talk a little bit about, I guess you want to say, bad trainers and misinformation. One of the probably the biggest topics, that I think is right now. It seems like there's so many trainers, online today or just everywhere with huge followings. I see them on Instagram all the time, but some of them have little to no understanding of, biomechanics, movement quality, progression, or injury prevention. How dangerous in your eyes or in your opinion is misinformation in athlete development right now?
I think it's a huge issue, and I think it's not, maybe kids aren't going to get hurt doing it, but I think what happens is you miss out on the opportunity to get better. And I think, if you have a kid that's doing misinformation and bad training, they just don't get better and they just stay stagnant. And then that's when the burnout sets in versus if a kid has true information and they're getting better. And I'm not, I have a kid that I won't mention names, but to me was doing horrible training. Not his fault, not his dad's fault, not his parents' fault. They thought that's what's appropriate. And, probably 2, 3 months ago started with me and now is seeing, able to dunk a basketball, able to do this. And it's just limiting these kids. And I don't think anybody's intentionally like sitting there trying to screw these kids. I just think these trainers just don't know.
Yeah, and sometimes you see those drills, they look crazy online, but actually probably have the least value for basketball, right? So how much damage do you think, I guess, Instagram, social media has done to like what people think good training looks like?
A lot. And I think, a lot of times, like, with development of these kids, like I said, you forget they're 12, 13, 14, 15. So they're going to miss some developmental windows because they're doing dumb stuff. And then they're playing catch up. And then with an already crazy schedule, now they're having to play catch up on top of that. So now they're even overloaded more. And I think, Rondell and I used to talk all the time, and we all do dumb stuff when we're young, but like, he attributed a lot of his injuries later in his career to just dumb stuff he did when he was young and just mismanagement and just overload. And, a tendon, a ligament, arthritis or tendinopathy or anything like that isn't going to show up when you're 15, 16. But if you're still playing at 21, 22, 23, that's when all that stuff starts showing up. It's like a rubber band. It's not just going to snap. You're going to start getting little frays. It's going to start dry rotting before it snaps. And then eventually over time, it's just going to snap. And that's not necessarily going to happen all the time. But, all this stuff does add up. And the other thing is with these youth athletes, if you're on a good program, I tell kids all the time, every time you step on a basketball court is a negative. So what we're trying to do is balance that out with a positive, AKA the weight room. But with bad training, you're not ever able to get a positive. It's just negative, 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 and eventually it's horrible. You overdraw your account.
Yeah, in the negative, all the time in the negative, and you know how that is. That's just extra stress.
Yep.
But here's probably one of the biggest questions for like parents is like how can parents like identify whether somebody is actually trained or qualified to train their child?
I think the easiest thing. I mean, there's nothing wrong with asking for credentials. Who you trained, how long you've trained, what's your longest client. I would say like I've trained Ray Spalding since he's been probably 13 years old. And I mean, he can get anyone in the world he wants to train him. And I think that's a huge key is when you start getting, and not everyone's fortunate enough to train college athletes, but college athletes can stay on campus with their strength coach. But if you have college athletes coming back home to you, that means something, at least to me. They have other options. They can stay at their university or they can come home. I think another thing to look for is a one-size-fits-all approach. So if you walk into someone's facility and they got 10 kids going and 10 kids are doing the same thing, somebody's getting screwed. And then I think lastly, just look for cues. If the trainer's not correcting anybody, if he's not individualizing it for each person. So let's just say you, me, two other people are training. We may be doing a squat, but there's no way that all four of us are equal, even if we're the same capacity on the court. So, there should be progressions and regressions going on for every individual. And if there's not, they probably don't know what they're doing. And I think lastly, I think just it's sad to say, but I think the first thing you have to worry about is just make sure your kid's safe. There's so many weirdos and just weird things happening in today's world that I would be very hesitant to send my kid to someone that I don't know that they have to. I have to know someone that's trained with them to make sure my kid's safe. If that makes sense.
It
There's just
definitely
much
makes
that goes
sense.
into it.
So, what are some major red flags parents should immediately pay attention to?
I think if you go in a facility that has no weights, that's a red flag. And it sounds crazy, but a lot of these guys will go by hurdles, maybe even a Vertimax, some bands, and just do all this crazy jump training and run training and obstacle course things. I think that's the number one sign. I think there are exceptions to the rule, but if that individual has never coached someone to be strong or they've never been strong, it's going to be very hard to get a kid strong. I think you have to. I think there's some former athletes that are very bad at what they do too, but I think there has to be success stories. You know what I mean? I think there has to be people that you've taken and developed, and it's not about NBA athletes. It's not about NFL athletes. Are you able to take a kid and make them better? And it doesn't matter if they play college or not, but you need to. For me, I would have to have at least a few references of, I recognize this kid 2 years ago, and now I recognize this kid since they've been with you, and it's night and day. And obviously, the trainer's not 100% responsible for that, but they play a pretty big role. And it doesn't have to be someone that wasn't good that now is okay. I mean, and I keep using him for example, but let's take Jordan. I started training him after his freshman year. He's obviously a great basketball player. There's a massive jump from freshman year to sophomore year. And part of that is he's gotten older, mature, but a lot of it is his training's on point. He can jump off both feet now. His tendons can absorb. His muscles are stronger. There's a big factor in that. And I can assure you that during that time, never once did we get on a Vertimax or do any crazy jump training or anything like that.
Yeah, and that just goes back. It's so important because some trainers that there seems like they're building more content creators, instead of building athletes. So I think what you said about having references and having, like, I guess, correlation of you've had this work with this athlete for this period
Right.
of time and see what growth you've actually seen in that athlete.
And I think, like I personally, like I would love to do more social media, but I'm too busy working. I'm too busy training people. And at the end of the day, I don't want to mess with it. And I think a lot of these people, they're great at business and they're probably better than me at business, but that's what they do. And, they sell stuff and they're marketers. And like you were saying, they're great at social media.
Yeah, just content creators. So let's talk about what actually translates to performance. We've all seen the videos of the crazy cone drills, the balancing on unstable surfaces, the tennis ball reaction drills. Doing seems like they're doing 5 or 6 things at once. It's going to get views online, and it's a great marketing tool. But how much of that stuff actually translates to real game performances?
So what we do here is we start from the ground up every session. So for a lot of these athletes, your feet and your big toe is the most important thing in your body. So we'll start with that, and then we go up to ankle, then we go up to knee, go up to hip, and go up to upper body. So it's essentially, if your big toe can't function properly in flexion and extension, then your knee can't function, your ankle can't function, your hips can't function. And then from there, we break it down. There's 3 planes of motion. So there's sagittal plane, which is going to be up and back, forward and backwards. You have frontal plane, which is side to side. And then you have transverse, which is going to be rotational. So we try to hit each and every one of those planes of motion every time we come in. And then we try to pick up movement patterns. So a squat, a hinge, a vertical press, a horizontal press, a vertical pull, a horizontal pull. And we try to hit those movements every time an athlete comes in. So what we're trying to do, or at least I'm trying to do, is upload all these images in their library in their head. So we're creating angles and chaos that they're going to see in a game in a safe environment, meaning my facility. So when it's not a controlled environment, AKA the court, their body knows how to not only respond to that, but it's seen these movements. It's seen, let's say, knee over toe, or it's seen a shin angle, something crazy. So if a kid's coming down the court, and let's just say his knee pops over his toe and he's never been in that position, he doesn't know what to do. If he's already been in that position and he can hold it in my facility, it's just clockwork, if that makes sense. So what we're trying to do is upload as many images up here, so when brain shoots that signal out, we have a much quicker reaction time.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing you said there was reaction time because time matters. And when you're like, I think you went over this, but like when you're training your guys, what's the core things that truly matter most? I know you just said like the big toe,
We
but what
do
are
balance. We'll spend a ton of time in like proprioception balance. We spend a ton of time doing isometrics, which is just holding a position. So you got to think, if I can hold a position that's similar to basketball movement for 30 seconds with, say, a 60-pound dumbbell, now when I'm going in a game, it's effortless. And I think the last thing is just get strong. And I mean, when I say strong, it's from every aspect. There's no legs have to be strong, hips don't, or arms don't, but it's just being strong so you can absorb contact. So like for instance, like all the core stuff we do is resisting movement. So like we're doing like anti-rotation stuff. So if I have a band out here and I'm turning this way, now I'm trying to keep it from me turning back. So now when I'm driving down the lane and I get bumped, instead of me getting off track or getting off my path, I stay centered, if that makes sense.
yeah, I think a lot of players, younger players and parents don't understand how much strength plays a factor in basketball. When you think of strength, everybody thinks of football, but college basketball players or high level high school
Yeah.
kids, you have to be strong to absorb all that
Well,
contact
and the
and
other
still
thing is
play.
too, the stronger you are, the better your recovery is. So if I have someone that's weak and I'm broken down, now I'm starting, let's say I start at 80%, but my 100% is still weak. Now my 80% is even weaker. If I'm strong as shit and I'm break down to even a 90%, I'm still stronger than my competition at 90% than they are 100%. So it helps you. The stronger you are, your ceiling is here. Even if you drop down, you're still stronger than your next opponent. So you're starting the day off in a better spot, if that makes sense. The stronger you are.
Yeah. So, what are some of the most underrated things young athletes or players should prioritize if they generally want long term success?
I think, I think it goes back to weights. Just getting on a good program, and I think for me, like there's no, like I said, we try to get those planes of motion and those movement patterns. Outside of that, like if an athlete has a favorite, if they have a favorite squat position, I don't care as long as they squat. I think people pay so much attention to putting, let's just say I'm putting a program together and I have barbell squats and they won't deviate from that. I don't care if a kid squats with dumbbells. I don't care if they squat off a wedge. I don't care if they squat with a kettlebell, as long as they squat. And I think we just get so fixated on the specificity of what we're doing. We're missing the big picture. We're doing this for the movement pattern. So as long as they're doing that, we're good. But I think weights is huge. It's non-negotiable nowadays. And then I think just the consistency. I got guys that love to lift weights. They'll be in here for 90 minutes. I got guys that hate it, but they know that they got to do at least 30 to 40. And just realize where you're at in that. And it's okay if you're on this side or this side, but know what you're capable of and know what you enjoy. And it's kind of like everybody asks what the best program is. I can give you the best program, but if you don't do it consistently, or it's going to be out of your wheelhouse, the worst program that you're going to do is better. If that makes sense, So it's like I got pro guys that come in, and I know that I got 30 minutes from the time they walk in. At 30 minutes, they're grabbing their keys, they're out. So I'll cram as much shit as I can in that 30 minutes, but at least I know what I got.
Yeah. And one thing I think people overlook is like movement efficiency. Elite guys make it look easy because their bodies are moving more efficiently, right? Not because they're always doing the hardest workouts
Right.
possible.
Well, it's kind of like basketball trainers, and I'm stepping over my boundary here, but like all these crazy dribbling drills and all this, your goal is not to dribble too much in a game. Watch Klay Thompson get 40 points on like 6 dribbles or something, and it's just like you said, it's the efficiency aspect, and it's like what I try to do with my athletes is not only have I done this, I went to school for it, and if I followed what I was taught in college, I would lose every athlete possible because it's a 7-minute warm up, and then it's a 7-minute activation, and then it's a 10-minute cool down. So now I'm 27 minutes deep with no real work. So you got to get creative. So I can take an athlete, they can come in cold, I can get them warmed up in and out. I like to have 50 to 60 minutes, but if you got 30, I can get a better workout than most people are going to get in 90.
So you just
And
try to
just
get as much in there.
well, I mean, just cut the crap out. There's no need for you're a basketball player, so why do you need to do 3 chest exercises? You need one plate. You need something to cover that movement pattern, and you're good. Move on. We don't need to do bench press, push ups, flies. You know what I mean? You've hit that area. Move on to the next. And
So
figure out what the focus is of the day. So every day that like my athletes come in, we have a focus point, and then we have a minor. So what our focus is going to be our strength output, like our major contributor that day, and then we're going to work accessories to activate muscles that we're going to use tomorrow, if that makes sense.
it does. So I want to talk a little bit about recovery, injury prevention, and longevity. Injuries. We see it a lot. It seems like they're becoming more common and serious in youth sports, and I think it's due to like the burnout, the overuse. What do you think? We're seeing injuries happen at younger ages. Why do you think we're seeing those more injuries at younger ages than ever before now?
I think it's back to the year-round model. Like I said, those kids don't get a break. Um, I have one girl in particular. She's torn. She's 16, and she's torn 3 ACLs.
Oh
And
boy.
at a certain point, they just can't catch a break. And I mean, like I said, they do. and I'm not knocking these coaches necessarily, but we do dumb stuff in practice. We do dumb stuff. We do timed mile drills, which is maybe the dumbest basketball thing in the world. Why are you going to run a mile as fast as you can? You're never going to do that in a game. And it's just, I think we need to get away from, there needs to be accountability and punishment, but when we're just running these kids to death and suicides and doing this, like let's individually skill train. Let's try to get better. We need to be crisp with things. There need to be like I said, accountability. But when you're just running these kids into the ground on top of game after game, it's just they can only last so long. And it goes back to, like I said, most of these kids are terribly weak to start with. So now we're going to break them down Monday. They're going to wake up Tuesday at 70%. By Wednesday, they're probably at 50%. And then you wonder why they get hurt.
Yeah, and no, I want to talk about how important is sleep, nutrition, hydration, mobility work, and recovery, like compared to actual workouts.
So you can only work out as hard as you can recover, if that makes sense. So your recovery dictates how hard you're able to push. And I think people fail to realize, they look at these NBA players or NFL guys, they have personal chefs. They're on, whether people like it or not, they're on peptides, hormones, different things like that are helping their recovery. They got hyperbaric chambers. They got all kinds of stuff that we don't have access to. And the other thing is, they're 25, 26, 28 years old, and they spent 10 years building themselves up. Now when we're at a high school level, the only thing we have is nutrition and sleep. And that's pretty much it. So, I mean, the better your nutrition is, the longer you're sleeping, the better. But the problem is, like with high school, what do? We have practice. We have practice or skill training before school. So now we're at school at 6, 5:30 in the morning. We go to school all day. We have practice after school. We get home late, and it's just a toxic environment, unfortunately.
Yeah, and
And
I think
these kids are in school and then they can't eat. A lot of them wake up, they skip breakfast, they don't eat school lunch because they don't like it, but they don't wake up in time to make a lunch. So now the first thing they're eating is right before practice. It's 3 o'clock, so they're undernutritioned, and then they're sleeping probably 6 hours when they need 8 or 10, and it's just you can only grind so long before something's going to happen.
yeah, and I think a lot of the guys or athletes focus like 95% on some kind of training and almost zero on recovery. But like you just said, recovery is training, right?
It is, but you can't train unless you recover. So it's kind of like what I try to do with most of my kids is, I give them minimums nutrition wise. So, it's either you have to eat X amount of times a day, you got to eat X amount of grams of protein a day, and then anything they get in addition to that is just a bonus. But I try to give them the minimum of like hydration. I try to give them the minimum of, protein, carbs, and I don't want to get too complicated, but I think the other thing that these people don't realize is, like, you want your kid to eat healthy, but there's no way that they can eat healthy and get the number of calories they need. So, it's a tricky balance, but I mean, and it's based off your activity level. But like I said, every kid I train, I try to give them minimums, and hope they do it. And I mean, if I'm not gonna say fast food's great, but if your only option is fast food or no food, fast food's better, especially for those young kids. At least there's calories, and these kids forget that's your energy source. It's your food. Period. That's the only energy you get. That's the only thing that can create energy in your body is the food and the calories. So when you start looking at calories as your shuttle for energy, then you have to have them.
Yeah, I know. I used to kind of trip out when I see a couple guys drinking chocolate milk, and I'm like, "What are you doing drinking chocolate milk?" And then I realized, like, I was like, "That's really not healthy," but they're trying to get in the calories, trying to get something in to give them some gas, right? So I don't. I mean, it's not a protein drink, but now a lot of these protein drinks, they're just milkshakes, really. But they're just getting the calories in to have some kind of energy because they're getting ready to put a lot out.
Yep. And it's just
And
consistency of, it goes back to, and that's what people forget is with nutrition, with hydration, with training, it's all the same thing. If you do something great one day and then you do it bad the next, you're still in the hole. So like hydration, for instance, like when kids cramp during games, it's from the previous days. You're not loaded properly. And then once your electrolytes deplete, we don't know any different. So we drink more water, which just depletes the electrolytes even more. So now we're just in a deficit. And it's just, I think if it'd be hard, but if we could have someone go into each team preseason and just give them a rundown of just an hour presentation of how the body works, how nutrition works, how electrolytes work, what's needed, I think we'd just be in a much better spot.
Yeah. What are some of the simple things that athletes can start doing immediately
Right.
to help better protect their bodies and improve their performance, like long term?
Yep.
What are some things, like simple things that athletes can do,
Uh,
like
well,
immediately?
I think just like I was saying, I think just if you get a minimum, a training minimum, I mean, it's hard to find someone, but if you find someone that you trust with training at least once a week during the season, um, and then simple things with like hydration, I think, take half your body weight. That's the minimum ounces of water a day. Preferably you do an ounce per pound of body weight. And then, be smart enough. If you're in a hot gym, start preloading electrolytes. Obviously, they're going to get depleted as you sweat. Everyone sweats at a different ratio, and everyone sweats a different mixture, if that makes sense. So you may sweat more salt out than I do. I may sweat more magnesium, whatever. But start preloading the electrolytes so they don't get drained out, and then just have some minimums of nutrition. And it doesn't have to be rocket science. It could be after every basketball training session. It could be like you said, I'm going to eat an apple and chocolate milk, but I'm going to do it 7 days a week. Every night before bed, I'm going to have my biggest meal. And it does. Every morning I'm going to eat breakfast. It's small things like that that add up. And I think people, like I was saying earlier, we forget the major things here, and we're worried about going and getting like localized cryotherapy when you know what, just go to bed and eat a meal. You're probably going to be better off, and it's going to be cheaper. But I mean, we try to do the stuff that's fancy, and you can't. It's not fun to post. I'm just making it up. Eating spaghetti and going to sleep, but it's fun to post when you're in a crowd chamber and it looks cool and it's neat, but you're really not getting anything.
Yeah, most definitely. If you could give one piece of advice to like the young athletes trying to reach the next level, like what would it be?
Just set some goals. I think I think the old school method of just making a weekly chart and then a daily chart and just putting check marks. Like I was saying, make sure you're getting X amount of shots up. Make sure you're getting your training in. Have your minimums with nutrition, hydration, things like that. And I'm a visual person, so I think seeing those check marks or being able to check things off helps. And I think it's just accountability. Um, Even stupid things, get a gallon of water, fill it, drink it every day. You can see the progress, and then if you fall short on those, you're still probably ahead of 95% of the people. And I think the other thing is just realizing, like you were saying earlier, this isn't an overnight thing. This is a grind, and it's as you should love the process, because it's going to take years and years for you to develop. And you're going to have some kids that shine in high school early. You're going to have some kids that shine in middle school early. It doesn't matter. Everyone's on their own path. And I think that's the biggest thing. And I think the thing that kind of upsets me the most through this whole process is I'll have kids that go major Division 1. I'll have kids that go D2, D3, NAIA. All of them are a huge accomplishment. And I think some of the kids that go to smaller schools, I'm not going to say are ashamed sometimes, but it's like, oh, I'm just going here. You're better than 99% of the people in the world. And I think just if you're able to play beyond high school, you've done amazing. And I
Yeah,
think
most
just
definitely.
these kids just need to give themselves some grace. I mean, they're kids, and I think the most important thing, which I've talked about to some other people, is like the discipline that you gain with sports is going to transfer to the rest of your life. At some point, basketball, football, baseball, whatever is going to end for everybody. It doesn't matter if it's at high school, college, pro, but it's going to end. But these traits and these characteristics and habits that you're getting through this process are going to stay with you the rest of your life.
Most definitely. So what advice, would you give to parents trying to navigate like all the noise in today's basketball world?
Uh, man. I think the main thing would be don't don't feel bad for going against the grain. You don't have to be a follower with your kid doesn't have to be a sixth grader on a travel team. Your kid can work out in the backyard or the park and go play as a kid and develop naturally and still be okay. We don't. I make a living doing this, but not everyone needs a trainer. Not everyone needs a skill trainer. And I think at a certain point you might need one for some weaknesses or some indeficiencies, but just don't get caught up in the whole scene. Me personally, like I have my own kids, and I don't mean this rudely. I'll do anything in the world for them, but like I don't want to spend all weekend at a volleyball tournament. And I know that sounds terrible. And I mean, I could sit and make my kids probably the best movers around. But unless they want to do it, I'm not going to do that, if that makes sense. And I think, unfortunately, a lot of parents may live through these kids, but just make sure your kids.
Yes.
And I mean, I know for me personally, my parents never pushed me like that. But like, I got to a point when I played soccer growing up that we were playing, travel ball before travel ball even existed. And it got to the point where I just hated it. And I mean, I was, in a very non arrogant way, like I was very good, but every practice I just dread it. And there's just nothing worse in the world than just dreading every single day. So I think just make sure your kids enjoy it. And as long as they enjoy it, just let them have fun. And I mean, if they end up going to Michigan, fantastic. If they end up going just to play through high school, fantastic. If they play just intramurals, guess what? They're still gaining something from it. And, it's not, everyone's not destined to be a pro.
Yeah, most definitely. I think the biggest thing is like I get out is like you just said, basketball or sports are going to end, but like learning like the discipline, learning how consistency really helps you. The trust, respect other people.
Well,
Being able to listen to others. Like it correlates way more than being better on a court or on a field, right?
that and the other thing is we forget, like, I see it within my facility. The coolest thing about sports is you have kids from different backgrounds, different economic status, different races, different culture, everything interacting, going after the same goal. And I think that's the neatest thing about sports is you get to interact with people that you would never be in the same room with. And, for once, we're all getting along. It's a neat community. And I think, if we embrace that, everybody's good. But I think we just lose sight of that sometimes. And it's just, to me, to see kids from private schools with public schools interacting and kids from this side of town with this side of town interacting, it's a cool experience. And I think sports is one of the few things that can kind of do that for us.
Yeah, most definitely. So, the last thing before we hop off of here is what's next for Brooks Sports Performance, and where can people follow your work or sign up or just learn more about you?
So my Instagram is Brooks Sports Performance. They can DM me through there. I need to get more active on it. I don't do a whole lot on there except post some stories. I think the next thing for me will be opening a one-stop shop here in Louisville, meaning strength conditioning, therapy, skill training. Um, I won't mention names, but there's a specific NBA player that I've done some work with. That there's a very good chance we're going to bring a facility here, um, to where kids can literally go from the court straight to strength training, and then also have a recovery room. So I think, there's some places that partner together, but ultimately, especially in this city, you got kids going somewhere for training, you got some kids going somewhere else for skill training, you got kids going over here for therapy. So they're driving all over town, and it would just be nice to have a one-stop shop. Um, and I think you produce such a better model of an athlete that way because everyone's in house. So, like right now, I work with a physical therapist who I love, but we have separate facilities. So something gets lost in translation sometimes. But if we have the whole team in one facility, there's nothing lost in translation. So the athlete can go from activation work straight to the court, straight to strength training, and then to PT if they need it for scraping, dry needling, massage, whatever it is, and just a one-stop shop.
That's awesome, man. This has like been an incredible conversation. Huge thank you again to Brian Brooks of Brooks Sports Performance for joining us tonight on the Pure Prospects podcast. This is one of the conversations that athletes, parents, coaches, and trainers really need to hear because there's so much misinformation out there right now. Make sure you guys follow Brian and Brooks Performance on Instagram. And, you're going to see him with more sports or more athlete development and training, like a lot of stories, right, Brian? And always, subscribe to Pure Prospects here on Substack. Over on our YouTube channel, you'll catch this interview over here a little later. Follow Pure Prospects on all social media platforms. We're on Instagram, X, Facebook, and also here on Substack. I'm Cody Thomas. We'll catch you guys later on the next episode of the Pure Prospects podcast.
Appreciate you.
See you later, Brian.
See you, bud.